Wolong Fallen Dynasty. Alright, let's jump right into this. Obviously, I've only played the demo of Wolong Fallen Dynasty so far. You can tell by my subscriber count that I have not received early access to the full game. That being said, I'm not sure there's anything left in the demo I can really do. I've played it on PS5 and Xbox Series X and have completed it fully 3 times. I've also started a few runs just to experiment with build ideas, so I've kinda ran through the game pretty thoroughly at this point. I'm also a Souls-like addict and have very recently played through Sekiro, so I'm very familiar with the similarities and differences between Wolong and Sekiro. So what are my first impressions of the game based solely on the demo? Well, I've been excited for this game for a while since it was announced at the Xbox Showcase last summer, I think it was. Not only did it look great, but it's from a developer with a good track record. That being said, this game is nothing like I expected. I mean that in the best way possible though. When I first started playing, it was pretty obvious there was some amount of Sekiro influence present, if for no other reason than the deflection mechanic being so important in combat. However, once you spend a bit more time with the game, you start to realize how little it actually has in common with Sekiro. The biggest difference between the deflection mechanic in Wolong when compared to Sekiro is whether or not you're required to use it. Sure, there are plenty of Sekiro challenge runs out there where they don't use deflection, but for a standard playthrough of Sekiro, you'll struggle to beat a single enemy, let alone a boss, if you don't deflect their attacks. In fact, beating most of the important bosses in the game without deflection requires tactics that borderline on exploiting the game's mechanics. That couldn't be further from the way deflection works in Wolong. In Wolong, deflection is possibly the strongest option you have in any given scenario. However, rarely ever is it actually required. I would even argue that enemy critical attacks are the only time I suggest you use it no matter what. Outside of critical attacks, it will come down to your personal playstyle and build. That being said, what else is important? I'm going to start by saying I agree with everyone that dislikes the deflection button being tied to the same button as the dodge. I have really thought about why they chose to do this, and to be honest, I'm kind of confused. The deflection and dodge mechanics are so intertwined that even single pressing the B or circle button while moving incorporates a short dash into your deflection. Not only that, but your equip load not only changes your dodge significantly, but also prevents you from deflecting at all if you're overburdened. Obviously, I don't yet understand the full implications of the mechanics here, but it seems like such an obvious choice to do exactly what Sekiro did and tie the deflection to the block mechanic. Especially since, from my experience, blocking is only there for the rare occasion when a player likes to block or is really bad at deflection. I have yet to come across a single situation where blocking is the ideal choice in Wolong. Unless the full game makes blocking important at some point, it seems to me that it's more of a default inclusion than an important mechanic, which begs the question, why not use the block button for deflection? Team Ninja has a history of fixing control schemes that aren't broken to the dismay of their fan base. Not that they have to copy the classic FromSoft control scheme, but I'm just saying, they seem to have their own ideas on what the perfect control scheme is. I get the feeling that they not only wanted to encourage deflection rather than dodging, but also attempt to differentiate their mechanics from Sekiro. To be honest, they're free to do whatever they want, and I won't personally think any less of them. However, I can't really come up with a good reason they made this decision other than attempting to do their own thing regardless of the side effects it may have. So far, the only real downside I've had is you'll sometimes dodge on accident, since double tapping the deflect button causes you to dodge. If you attempt to deflect, but are too late and then hit the button a second time to try and deflect a follow-up attack, you'll accidentally use the incredibly long-range dodge and end up fighting a completely different enemy somewhere else in the level. It hasn't really been a big issue for me, but I've seen a lot of people struggling with it. The unfortunate reality is that it's not really a problem for people that are decent at deflections, but it has the potential to be game-breaking for someone who is really bad at deflections. I imagine someone constantly dodging into walls when they instinctively spam the deflect button on accident. The next thing I want to talk about is attacking. Attacking in Wolong is completely different from the standard Souls-like style of attack. Almost every move you do with every weapon is incredibly artistic looking. From what I recall, They said they wanted to incorporate real martial arts into the movesets as much as possible, so that likely explains the incredibly complex movesets your character does just by simply tapping the fast attack button. This is on top of the relatively fast attack speed most weapons have. Even the slowest weapons in the demo are very fast after your initial attack startup. Most standard enemies are also really easy to stagger, so the combat kinda ends up feeling like hack and slash while you're on the offensive and Souls-like while you're on the defensive. This feeling will be somewhat familiar to anyone who played Sekiro or Bloodborne. The problem with speeding up Souls-like combat too much is it quickly reaches a speed beyond what human reaction time can manage, so in order to make it work, you essentially have to find a way to use Souls-like mechanics to trade hack and slash style bursts with enemies while maintaining the player's control over the situation at all times. So I imagine it's pretty complicated. This is exactly where Wo Long fits into things. Next, I'm going to talk about martial arts and spells a little bit. So every weapon comes with 1 or 2 martial arts on it. I'm assuming it's tied to the rarity somehow, but these are essentially special moves. I wouldn't say they're on the same level as Ashes of War from Elden Ring. They're mostly still pretty standard attacks or combos, just a little stronger or longer than what your normal attack is. I'm going to assume the full game allows you to change these somehow at some point, but the demo doesn't, so it's kind of hard to say much other than just say, I like the options it opens up. You have your fast attack, your soul attack, up to 2 martial arts, and then up to 4 spells. From what I've heard, there's some sort of PvP, so hopefully this will keep things varied and interesting. So far, I'm a fan though, but it's kind of hard to say much more than that. As far as spells go, you have 5 stats that you can upgrade as you would expect. Different weapons scale with different stats, of course. The different stats also have different random benefits stat-wise. They're not random, there's just a ton of them. You also get points that allow you to unlock spells as you upgrade your stats. These spells are also tied to those 5 main stats, so if you're upgrading the fire phase, for example, you'll have the ability to unlock different fire-based spells. These vary from weapon buffs to ranged offensive attacks. It's interesting to see that they didn't want there to be a specific mage build. They wanted every build to have access to spells. While the spells you get access to in the demo are heavily limited and I didn't use them as much as I probably should have, it was nice to have my preferred melee focused build and then have the bonus option of whatever spells that build happened to unlock on top of it. There are also obvious builds that will focus more on spells than melee and vice versa, so I'm excited to see how that goes in the full game and how it pans out in the long run. Overall, martial arts and spells feel much more like an expansion of the Souls-like moveset rather than a class you can choose, which I guess is pretty nice. I'm not sure how much I'll use them or how important they'll be in the long run, but they did a great job of including a ton of options in the player's moveset without forcing you to use any of them or build around them at all. I also want to quickly point out that weapons and armor have a ton of different stats to worry about. I shouldn't say worry since most of them really don't make or break anything, but I've seen a lot of people struggling with the deflection mechanic. If you look at the stats for any given weapon, there are a few different deflection-based stats, the most important being deflection difficulty. I'm not yet sure exactly how this works, but the game highlights stat increases blue and stat decreases red. So if you go to your weapons and find the highest deflect difficulty stat increase, this may help practicing the deflection mechanic. I personally found the deflection window to be one of the most forgiving I've ever used, and I'm not saying that's good or bad, it just is what it is. From my experience, the deflection timing works well with the overall pace of combat and speed of the gameplay. Alright, I'm not going to talk about the story at all, mainly because I assume there are dozens of hours worth of story to experience in the base game alone, but also for the sake of avoiding spoilers, it's also kinda hard to know if anything will be different in the full release. So, finally, level design. When I first started playing, I wasn't really enjoying the level design that much. The mini-map seems to indicate the general direction you want to go, but it wasn't very helpful, since the levels often have pretty roundabout ways to take you where you need to go. They also seemed pretty intent to hide random items absolutely everywhere they could. This, it seems to carry over from the Neo series where you have like a Diablo-style loot system and a microtransaction mindset of game development. I'm not saying the game will be pay to win or even have a bunch of microtransactions. I have no idea what the microtransaction situation will be in Wo Long, but you're constantly collecting gear and items, which feels like it comes from the more microtransaction heavy side of gaming. The constant item collection in the Neo games really took away from the experience for me, but so far in Wolong it's much better. Opening chests automatically picks up the items, and enemies drop everything as one pickup rather than 5, so it's much better so far, at least for me. It just drove me so crazy in Neo when, you know, you kill an enemy and they just drop stuff everywhere. I just never understood that. Anyway, the levels included in the demo have a way of making you feel like you've traveled much further than you really have. You'll fight all sorts of enemies and climb walls and drop through buildings and get to the end of the level and realize everything was right next to each other the whole time. The inclusion of Sekiro-style stealth mechanics like the death blow really helped the level shine for me, because there are always more enemies than you realize, and it's always helpful to pick off a couple unnoticed before charging in. Overall, the world design so far feels great, and the level design is interesting while remaining compact enough to avoid dragging. Remember though, I'm just talking about the demo here. The thing I would say I like the most about the game so far is it feels like you're constantly doing something. Mostly fighting, but you never really feel like you're lost or bored unless you decide to search every possible corner for items after clearing an area. At which point it's kind of convenient anyway, I guess. The thing I would say I hate the most so far is the obvious video game feel Wolong has, which is not only a carryover from the Neo games, but all Team Ninja games and even more Koei Tecmo games. The constant flashy graphics and beat 'em up style of everything you do is just a constant reminder that you're playing a game with numbers absolutely everywhere you look. I'm sure some people prefer this, but it's definitely not standard for a Souls-like game. So far it's not a big deal, but occasionally it can make it very difficult to see what's happening on screen. Oh, and by the way, I respect the decision to include a companion at all times because it does remind you constantly that there is a story. However, I'd always prefer to be solo. It does offer an experience I'm not used to, so that's been interesting, but if you're someone that can't stand an NPC companion doing wild stuff for no good reason and always reminding you when you get hurt, then Wolong might not be for you. I'll say this though, I haven't yet really been annoyed by it, even though it typically would bother me. Had I known there were companions before playing, I may have had an entirely different experience and entirely different expectations. But overall, I'm glad I had no idea, and I hope the main game at least has some parts where you're solo so you don't hear weird sounds behind you, go into attack mode just to realize your NPC friend is breaking boxes for no reason, which did happen completely randomly quite a bit. You'll just all of a sudden hear something crash and whip around and your companion is just sitting there hitting something. I don't know what that's about, but anyway, this is probably way longer than I intended already, since it's only supposed to be a first impressions for the demo version. But yeah, let's go.